There's a brand new Beatles release, folks. Beatles 64. I'm gonna boot it up now. Apparently, if you beat the game, you had to play it again as Pete Best. What's up, Beatle freaks? I'm back and I'm here to talk about everyone's favorite band. 2024, what a year it was. First we had the remaster of the Let It Be film in May, and then to close out the calendar we got two new releases themed around the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' 1964 arrival in America. The first is a box set of the Beatles US albums in mono, made up of their music from 1963 and 64. The second, and the one that I'll be spending the most time discussing in this video, is a brand new documentary called Beatles 64, about their whirlwind debut trip to the USA, which you can watch right now on Disney Plus, or according to Ringo Starr, the Disney Channel. If you'd like to jump straight to my review of Beatles 64, the timestamps are down the bottom, but for now, let's discuss this collection of vinyl records. Records that I myself have never actually owned, but have always been somewhat curious about. See, the Beatles albums that are largely accepted to be part of their official discography are the UK editions, released by EMI's Parlophone label. That's what's on streaming, they're the ones I'm familiar with, and unless you grew up in America during the 60s and 70s, they're probably the ones that you're familiar with as well. Okay, so what exactly are these albums and why are they significant? Well, I'm going to try and answer that in a rapid-fire explainer over the next 2 minutes. So it's 1962 and the Beatles released their first single, Love Me Do, in the UK. It performs fairly well on the charts, and so EMI's American subsidiary label, Capitol Records, are offered the opportunity to release it as a single in the States, but they turn it down. The Beatles then released their first UK album, Please Please Me, in March 1963, but again, Capitol isn't interested. There is, however, a smaller label that has nothing to do with EMI called VJ, and they take it upon themselves to release in America a couple of the Beatles' 1963 singles, like Please Please Me and From Me to You, but after they surprisingly fail to chart,
Please Please Me, flop. From Me to You, flop.
VJ lose interest in the Beatles, but not before releasing technically the first US Beatles album in January 1964 called Introducing the Beatles, which has most of the songs from Please Please Me. But by this point, Beatlemania has really accelerated in England, especially after the Beatles released their second UK album with the Beatles in November 1963, so now, finally, Capitol expresses interest in releasing Beatles music in America. Capitol, however, aren't happy about this Introducing the Beatles album from VJ, and then this big legal battle ensues, resulting in sales of the record ceasing by the end of 1964. In the meantime, Capitol's finally woken up to the mania, like, wow, gee whiz, these Beatle fellas sure are popular, but they're way behind now. The Beatles are already working on material for their third UK album, so Capitol, in an effort to catch up, decides to release their own Beatles albums on their own American label. But there's another hitch. Standard American albums only contain 12 tracks, but the UK versions have 14. Plus, Capitol wants to stick older Beatles singles on these albums as well, meaning that it's not going to be a one-for-one album matchup. So, starting in January 1964 and ending in March 1965, Capitol releases 7 Beatle albums, all spaced on average about a couple of months apart from each other. And suddenly, America is inundated with Beatle albums, which only heightens the growing phenomenon of Beatlemania in the States. And it is these 7 albums that make up the contents of the box set. Capitol kept up these American releases right through to 1966, making Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band the first Beatles album that retained its full track list and artwork in both the UK and the US, which I think also makes Sgt. Pepper loom larger in people's legend than the other albums because of that reason. But anyway, let's get back to the albums contained in this box set. The Beatles are coming. We've got Beat the Beatles, nice. We've got Meet the Beatles' second album, A Hard Day's Night, original motion picture soundtrack, Something New, The Beatles Story, more on this one in a sec, The Beatles 65, and The Early Beatles. These albums have been out of print on vinyl since 1995, so the fact that they're now able to be purchased again in mono with faithfully replicated artwork will, I'm sure, come as a real delight to those US fans who owned them when they were younger, or to just any collector of Beatles music. Inside each album, you've also got a 4-page insert containing original tape box information, plus an essay by American Beatles historian and author Bruce Spicer that details the history of each album. Now, if you're wondering if these sound any better than previous box sets, say the 2014 UK mono box set, the answer is no, But that's kind of the point here. These aren't all entirely new mixes. These are actually meant to come as close as possible to the original mono versions of the US albums. Which is a good thing that it's in mono, because not only did the Beatles prioritize mono for their UK albums, the stereo US albums had their EQ tweaked with all this like added compression and weird echoey reverb. It was that time when Capitol declared stereo as the future, and so didn't even ask for the original mono tapes and just instead folded down the left and right stereo channels into one mix, which I guess it didn't sound too bad, but it certainly wasn't what the UK got. But back then, it didn't matter. People were just happy that they could buy Beatle music. For these 2024 pressings, Kevin Reeves, the mastering engineer, cut mono mixes from the original analog tapes, but did so with the intention of getting as close as possible to how they sounded to American consumers back in 1964.
But this was really to try and mimic the sound and be true to the traditional sound of those first pressings.
Now, it's not a total replica. He has managed to improve the sound of these albums in certain areas where they've needed it.
Now, I don't mean make them sound exactly the same, but we had to make sure we were using the same assets that were used to cut those first records, make sure that everything was in line with those and true to the spirit of how they sounded.
But all this is to say that this is not an audiophile's release. This is a collector's release. The person who should go out and buy this box set is anyone who wants a slice of Beatles history, particularly as it pertains to America and the impression that audiences over there first had of the Beatles, which are faithfully contained in these vinyl records. Now, you can go out and buy these albums individually, with the exception of this one, The Beatles Story. This is exclusive to the box set. The Beatles Story is a double album featuring interviews, snippets from press conferences, and also orchestral versions of Beatles music underneath some spoken word narration of how the Beatles got to where they were by 1964. A sort of documentary album. The Beatles Story, a narrative and musical biography of Beatlemania. It's like spending a very special evening in the company of the Beatles themselves. This kind of thing is a novelty these days, as it's pretty easy to just look up the story of the Beatles. And of course, they haven't updated the voiceover or anything, so when I was listening to it, it quickly became apparent that they were getting some minor details incorrect, such as the pronunciation of the Quarrymen.
John Lennon, whose whole family was musically inclined, was also the first to form a group and called it the Quarrymen.
The Quarrymen. And confusing George Harrison's voice for Paul McCartney.
Paul McCartney explains the origin.
Got the name Beatles in a vision ages ago.
That's George. But I think there's a certain charm to these kinds of errors. Plus, you gotta remember, back in 1964, when America was suddenly being barraged by this band from every angle, this album helped to explain the context for their success. The question you've gotta ask yourself is if this one album is worth the extra money. Because in the States at least, and I'm saying the States because that's where most of my audience is from, in the States, these albums individually cost $29.98 or $179.88 for all six together, which I think is pretty reasonable. But for the box set, which only contains the addition of The Beatles Story, remember, and of course the box itself, this altogether will set you back $299.98. So, yeah, that one's gonna be up to you. I would say my favorite of these to listen through would be the Beatles' second album, which has a really rocking collection of songs from With the Beatles, plus some dynamite singles including She Loves You. This version of A Hard Day's Night is also something of a novelty, as it contains 4 orchestral versions of Beatles songs arranged by George Martin that appeared in the film but aren't included on the UK version. All in all, this is a neat bit of Beatles history that helps to explain how they became such a sensation over in the States and altered the course of popular music forever. Okay, so that's all for the box set. Now let's get into the documentary. And just a warning, I recorded this next part a couple of weeks ago, so I do look a bit different.
No, this is embarrassing. Can't we just see the Beatles, please?
First of all, why did this come out now? Well, the people over at Beatles Camp, over at Apple, they absolutely love their anniversaries. Like, I'm telling you now, we'll be getting a 60th anniversary Rubber Soul re-release in 2025. Mark my words. And because it's been 60 years since the Beatles set foot in the US for the first time, it makes sense to celebrate that with a documentary that explores their impact from the perspective of not only the Beatles themselves, but primarily from the people that were there to experience their arrival. The documentary is directed by David Tedeschi, who previously edited the George Harrison documentary Living in the Material World, directed by Martin Scorsese, who also happens to produce Beatles 64. When I first heard they were making this, I thought it sounded a lot like Ron Howard's documentary from 2016 called 8 Days a Week, The Touring Years, which mainly covers the years 1962 to 66 when the Beatles toured England, America, and the world. But Beatles 64 is literally just that 3-week period in February 1964 when the band traveled to New York, Washington DC, and Miami, but I would say the bulk of the documentary covers their time in New York City. It really is, as David Tedeschi said in Rolling Stone, a New York story. Okay, now to get to my review of Beatles 64, including my thoughts on how it tells its story, my key takeaways from the newly remastered footage and sound, and what I think of the alleged 17 minutes of never-before-seen footage. The first thing that got my attention before I even started watching it was the title, Beatles 64, not The Beatles 64.
Drop the, just
Beatles 64.
It's cleaner.
This might not seem like a big deal, and you know, it probably isn't, but I believe it's the first time that anything official from the Beatles has left off that the prefix. And I don't know, I suppose it's cleaner and perhaps more direct and modern, but yeah, definitely thought that it was notable. In terms of how it begins, I think the decision to open with the rise of President John F. Kennedy was a prescient one. Especially given that this documentary came out in a US election year, released a mere 3 weeks after the 2024 results came out. Kennedy's assassination and how it cast a dark cloud over America is often the context by which people like to explain how timely and needed the Beatles' arrival in the US really was. So opening with the spirit of hope and change brought on by Kennedy's time as president before his untimely death really sets the stage for the Beatles' arrival. Included in this sequence is footage of Idlewild Airport being rededicated as John F. Kennedy Airport, and I think there's something wonderfully poetic about America embracing the Beatles after JFK's assassination. And the first place the boys set foot once they land in America is the airport that is now named after the former president. So a really strong opening, I thought. Oh, and during the funeral sequence, we hear a sobering cover of All My Loving from Korean singer-songwriter Elaine Kim.
And I'll kiss you. Tomorrow I'll miss you.
I looked her up, and this cover was actually posted on YouTube just last year, and at the time of writing this review only has 2,080 views, and it doesn't seem to be on streaming anywhere, so congratulations, Elaine, on getting this included in the documentary. Incredible work.
And I'll send all my loving to you.
Then we get the title card, followed by our first footage of the Beatles. Now, I should say up front that the majority of the footage that you see of the band in trains, cars, and hotel rooms was recorded by brothers Albert and David Maysles on 16mm film for their 1964 documentary, What's Happening? The Beatles in the USA, which was then re-edited as The Beatles, the first US visit in 1991. I haven't actually seen either of these. I don't think they were ever like an official Beatles release from Apple. I think there was some rights issues originally. But this footage has also been used in basically every other Beatle-related documentary, from Anthology in the 90s to the aforementioned Living in the Material World. But never has it looked so crisp and sounded so clear. Like, here's an example of how this clip looked and sounded previously.
Are you filming now? Yeah. My arm is without looking.
Now here's the Beatles 64 version.
Are you filming now? Yeah. My arm was without looking.
Astonishing. This is once again thanks to Peter Jackson's Wingnut Studios, who seem to just get better and better at remastering old Beatle footage, starting with Get Back, then Let It Be, and now this. Plus you've got Giles Martin handling the audio production, both men utilizing the Magical Mouse software, which allows for voice and instrument isolation where previously there was no way to convincingly achieve such clarity. It's just staggering to be able to hear their individual voices coming through so clearly over the sound of the train and all the hubbub, as if they were being interviewed in present day. I felt just like John when he put on those headphones where if you speak, you can hear your own voice.
Talk? Who's talking?
Now, we've only seen this technology implemented on the later era Beatles footage, like the 1969 Get Back sessions. But now we're in early 1964, before the Beatles had a million number ones, starred in A Hard Day's Night, played Shea Stadium, taken acid, released Sgt. Pepper's, mourned the death of their manager, meditated in India, and campaigned for peace. That was their lived experience by the time they shot Get Back, and you can see the effects of it etched on their faces. But those looks of exhaustion and pensiveness are now replaced with innocence and exuberance as we time travel back 5 years to a period that comparatively feels like it's just the beginning of their journey. And that's what made me really excited about this documentary. It's going to give people the chance to see high quality footage of the Beatles as the young mischievous mop tops that the world first fell in love with, and remind modern viewers that these 4 cheeky lads are as important to the Beatles legend as these 4 icons playing on the rooftop. Of course, they weren't completely naive at this point. They've still played thousands of hours of live music in clubs and theatres, plus gained a few #1s in England, but were still relatively green compared to what was to come. When I first saw that footage of them playing She Loves You at their debut US gig at the Washington Coliseum, I really went, oh wow, out loud. Like, not only has this footage never been sharper, but the sound is incredible.
She loves you, and you know you should be glad.
The dynamic range that they've now been able to pull from this crummy audio is breathtaking. What I appreciated most from this cleaned up footage is how clear the expressions are of the girls in the back, watching the Beatles from behind. To be able to witness the pure glee on these fans' faces in 4K was just delightful, and reason enough for this documentary to be made, I think. And these fans are kind of the beating heart of this documentary, but more on them in a moment. For now, I just want to hold on the incredible clarity of this restoration. Like, I've only ever seen this footage from uploaded and re-uploaded clips on YouTube, which always look blurry and bad, but this is just stunning. The documentary actually demonstrates the difference in quality itself in the very next scene of the Beatles at their first US press conference after landing at JFK, where you've got this fuzzy and ancient looking footage that then gets immediately cleaned up, both in sound and vision. Like, look, you can see how Ringo's hair is slightly oilier than the others. Just little details like that go a long way with someone who's watched that press conference millions of times. Not only does the 60s footage look incredible, but the clips from the 90s of George, Ringo and Paul, that leftover material from the Beatles anthology, also looks absolutely superb. It really gives me hope that a future anthology re-release is on the cards, because I think it's still the best all-encompassing documentary series about the Beatles' journey. So 6 minutes into the Beatles 64, we get our first talking head interview from writer Joe Queenan.
My sister had the radio on, and I heard She Loves You.
I adore this guy, immediately getting emotional about hearing She Loves You on the radio for the first time.
It's like the light came on.
A relatable king. I will say there are quite a lot of these talking head interviews in Beatles 64, and some I find more valuable than others, but the existence of these interviews is a thematic through line of the documentary. This isn't a film that was made to simply recount events. It was made to give viewers insight into the impact of being a young American in the early to mid 60s, and what the arrival of these 4 strange-looking boys and their joyous music meant to these kids and young American adults, wondering what their purpose is in life and then being completely swept up in the mania and magic of the Beatles. But we also see the perspective of the adults, of the establishment, with shots of newspaper articles asking, are the Beatles overrated? Like, people online these days aren't having that same argument day in, day out. Are the Beatles overrated? Are teens being infected by Beatleitis? Is it neoliberal to listen to the Beatles? Fucking wild take, that one. And speaking of the Beatles, where are they in this documentary? No, not them, I mean the modern day ones that are still with us. Where are Paul and Ringo? Well, they certainly feature, unfortunately not via stuffy talking head interviews. We meet Paul at the Brooklyn Museum in New York City, where he's walking us through his photo exhibition, Eyes of the Storm, the corresponding book of which was released in 2023. Eyes of the Storm ties in nicely with the documentary, as it features photographs taken by Paul, mostly from the Beatles' first visit to the US, the same visit that Beatles 64 is covering. So I thought that was a clever way of reminiscing with McCartney via his own photographs from the period. Although I will say, would it kill him to provide us with just one new anecdote? As soon as I saw him pointing to that amazing photo of him and John playing their guitars in his childhood home, I knew exactly what he was going to say.
And at the end of it, he said, couldn't you sing She Loves You? Yes, yes, yes. He said, there's enough of these Americanisms around.
He'd say, son, there's enough of these Americanisms around. Couldn't you sing yes, yes, yes?
He said, there's enough of these Americanisms around. Couldn't you sing She Loves You? Yes, yes, yes.
Part of me is like, oh, come on, Elliot, just let this literal legend tell his stories. He's 82 now, and can we really expect him to be constantly coming up with new memories? But another part of me thinks, Well, he's also recently released another book called The Lyrics, where he divulges brand new reflections on his songwriting, so he's definitely capable of it, but something tells me that whenever it comes to these uber popular Beatle era memories, he's hit the ceiling with what he's comfortable revealing to the public. So I think we've just got to be content with the fact that Grand Dude's going to be telling the same stories we've heard a million times because that's what your granddad does. Ringo does it too, in fact, possibly even more. There's a point later in the documentary where Martin Scorsese asks if Ringo was into all the old noir films when he came to the States.
You guys sort of like New York, coming into New York, you like all the old noir films.
And first off, Marty, you're asking the wrong Beatle. Ringo was into like westerns and sci-fi movies, and that's it.
No, mainly for the music.
But then instead of exploring that, Ringo reverts back to his story of seeing New York for the first time and imagining the city like an octopus dragging the plane down.
I felt an octopus. I'm full of octopuses. Grabbing the plane and bringing me down.
Okay.
Yeah. It was so great.
Which we've also heard quite a few times before.
As the plane flew over New York, I really felt like some, sci-fi movie had gone down and a big octopus grabbed the plane and was dragging us down to New York.
Also, it's got to be quite rare to see Ringo talking to a bloke that's shorter than him. Now, please don't think that I'm bashing either Paul or Ringo. I literally couldn't love these men any more than I do, and I'm so happy that they remain this enthusiastic about telling their story, and we're just genuinely so lucky to have them around. And you know what? There's a good chance that the majority of viewers are hearing these anecdotes for the first time, so you know what? It's all good. Tell your stories, guys. At around the 10-minute mark, we get to what I consider to be the strongest element of Beatles 64, which is footage of their New York fans.
What do you like about the Beatles?
These ecstatic and somehow always out of breath girls who are simply just years ahead of the rest of the world with their adoration and love for these four guys.
You follow the girls and you'll find out where they are.
Harbingers of the counterculture that was to come.
Is there no American singer you like more now?
No! They can rot more we can.
I'm kind of obsessed with the young lady who recounts in rapid fire speed all the gifts the group bought the Beatles.
George likes 3 legs, so we bought him a pillow. And Paul likes to sketch and paint, so we bought him a sketch pen with chocolate. We bought John an ID. Yeah. We bought Ringo 2 science fiction books, and we're going to buy him the record my boyfriend got a Beatles.
And then there's the classical music girl holding a collection of arias, but who still thinks it's the Beatles that are the greatest. And I don't think I've seen anyone look happier on film than the girl floating on a cloud after touching Paul McCartney.
Another man just take my hand and he put his hand in mine. I took it.
And of course, we cannot forget those legends who snuck into the Plaza Hotel to try and meet the band but got kicked out by the cops.
Could you just tell us where they are so we know?
Including that one who got all the way to the 12th floor.
I went up to the 12th floor and they were there. And my policeman kicked me out.
My hero. It's that cheekiness and that playful skirting of the rules that's completely within the spirit of the Beatles. I just love seeing this. There's actually a 1978 movie directed by Robert Zemeckis that is entirely about these girls sneaking into the Ed Sullivan Theatre to try and meet the Beatles, called I Wanna Hold Your Hand.
I figured out a way to get into the Beatles hotel.
Very cool to see some real life examples though. This archival footage of the girls is countered with modern day talking head interviews of women who were there in New York in '64, desperate to see John, Paul, George and Ringo. I like how right off the bat we get 2 George girls.
Mine was George. My favorite Beatle was George Harrison, because he was so handsome and he was kind of sly. I thought he was very sexy.
I mean, one of them, Leonard Bernstein's daughter Jamie, switches to John and becomes a lifelong devotee.
Pretty soon thereafter, I switched to John Lennon for the rest of time. I can't listen to the Beatles in a casual way.
Girl same. But the other woman, Vicky Brenner-Costa, talking about
it's the spirit that puts you, your spirit for another spirit connects.
Yeah, that's the George girl through and through. And it's not just the women. For example, we also have music producer Danny Bennett share his mint-condition Beatles merchandise collection. I was particularly impressed that he managed to convince the head engineer of the Shea Stadium demolition team to cut off a part of his seat from when he saw the Beatles. I mean, that's some outstanding fandom right there. These interviews from these fans really helped to explain how their generation was always destined to be completely different from their parents. No conscription, no famine, no child labor, but teenagers who finally get to be teenagers, guided by their connection to the joyous music of the Beatles. A recurring theme of the documentary is the perceived unthreatening and unconventional masculinity of the Beatles. I appreciated writer Jane Tompkins' perspective on what made the Beatles distinct from other artists like Elvis Presley, whose sexually charged energy turned her off. She didn't get it
somehow. It didn't touch my heart.
But with the Beatles, she felt she could relax knowing they existed.
They were definitely boys, but they were soft. Their clothing and their hair, there was a softness often in their voices. The whole notion of male versus female is not prominent. They're sort of in between, or they don't emphasize the masculine versus the feminine at all. It's very inclusive in some way.
This is then supported by an archival televised interview from the 60s featuring author of The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan. She explains that the Beatles, with their longer hair, were saying no to the masculine mystique. No to the brutal, sadistic, tight-lipped, crew-cut, dominant, superior mentality. We don't need to be like those men who never show any softness.
These boys that are wearing their hair long are saying, no, I can be tender and I can be sensitive and I can be compassionate and I can admit sometimes that I'm afraid, and I can even cry. And I am a man, and I am my own man. And that man who is strong enough to be gentle, that is a new man.
I really responded to this perspective because it's one of my favorite qualities of the Beatles. The way that they showed how you can still be cool and intelligent and funny whilst also displaying sensitivity and softness and even occasionally appearing androgynous. That had a big impact on me. But what I found particularly fascinating is how towards the end of the documentary, modern-day Paul McCartney is asked what he'd say to John or to George if they were here today. And Paul replies,
I would say I love you, because growing up in Liverpool, you never said that.
Which just demonstrates that although the Beatles challenged the conventions of masculinity, that they were, to quote Betty Friedan, strong enough to be gentle, they still couldn't be completely vulnerable amongst themselves. That although their most enduring message was love is all you need, the Beatles still felt they couldn't say I love you to each other. It was just a reminder that although the Beatles didn't solve these outdated expectations of gender and conformity, they were certainly pioneers in breaking down these rigid constructs that we as a society have placed on ourselves. And yeah, that was a big takeaway for me. But now, putting aside outsider perspectives, what do we actually see of John, Paul, George, and Ringo in the documentary? The footage looks and sounds great, and it's wonderful to hear from the fans, but we want to see the boys, right? Well, yes, we do. And fortunately, this documentary really encompasses their individual personalities, particularly during this period. Like, if I had to describe this documentary, I'd say it was like a real-life version of A Hard Day's Night, which was itself made to recreate the phenomenon of Beatlemania on celluloid. When screenwriter of A Hard Day's Night, Alan Owen, spent time with the Beatles in preparation for the film, they told him that their lives were like a train and a room and a car and a room and a room and a room. These are more or less the confines that we witnessed the Beatles in for this documentary too. There's even a moment where John's looking pensively out a train window and absent-mindedly says,
"This is what our film will be like."
There's also a point earlier where the Beatles are sitting around bored in a hotel room, and again, John asks,
"Why aren't we going out?"
Which was the main objective of the Beatles in A Hard Day's Night, to escape the monotony of being cooped up before they're whisked away to the next event or interview. But it's within these moments of boredom and monotony that their personalities really shine through.
Funny mic though, so I say. Funny mic. I say it's a funny mic.
In one scene, we can see Paul telling the camera operator to film the funny mic in front of John.
If we could get the camera down on this mic, it'd be a real laugh. How about go on?
Pestering them to
defy convention.
And as soon as Paul starts pointing and hollering, John joins in. It's very charming. Something I noticed is that we see a lot more of that same playful spirit in the typically more withdrawn Beatles like George Harrison. Occasionally, it's almost like there's a total role reversal with George and Ringo playing the fools and John and Paul off by themselves, introverted and quiet. Like there's this moment on a train where John's clearly not feeling up to being on camera.
Am I supposed to be talking now? Just take it easy.
He's having a wistful Lennon moment to himself, but the camera's here anyway. But then along comes George, ambling up the carriage, wearing a funny hat and mugging for the lens. And what I love about John, and the Beatles' energy in general, is this attitude of yes and.
Oh, go on then. What should we do? Hi. Did you get that back?
Where George comes over, and without really setting it up, the two swap jackets just for fun. There'll always be one of them acting the fool in order to lift the spirits of another.
You just dried up and somebody else was already there with another
fab quip.
Yeah.
Ringo is also far more talkative in this film than Get Back, and can often be found acting like a total madman. George also has this bit where he pretends to work on the train, delivering refreshments.
You reckon the film here?
I really appreciate that they played Baby It's You during this moment where George says,
It's you. It's me.
Everyone's laughing and John does like a mad, exaggerated laugh. You can tell he's not in the same jovial frame of mind. Meanwhile, we pan over to Paul, who's also off by himself.
I'm not in a laughing mood even.
Oh, those sensitive boys. So yeah, if you saw Get Back and thought George Harrison was too mopey, watch Beatles 64. He's a regular Rowan Atkinson in it. Now, the remainder of what I have to say about the film isn't to support an argument or anything. This is just me sharing now some of my personal highlights. So I've seen this clip around somewhere before, but if you're paying attention, there's a part where you can hear John play the opening chords to Strawberry Fields Forever on a melodica.
Made 5, 6. I have to get on channel.
Very cool, and I kind of wish the Beatles used the melodica more often in their recordings. One of my favourite talking head interviews is from Ronnie Spector of the Ronettes, who was just an incredible amount of light and energy about her still. Really wonderful to hear from Ronnie and her story about taking the Beatles to Harlem so they wouldn't be noticed.
Nobody will notice you up there. And they didn't. They thought they were a bunch of Spanish dogs. Because it's Spanish Harlem.
Likewise, Smokey Robinson at 84 is still so sharp, so on point. Another interview highlight was Jack Douglas, whose biggest Beatle claim to fame was producing John and Yoko's Double Fantasy and Milk and Honey albums. His story, that's kind of told throughout the documentary, of visiting Liverpool as a youngster to play in the Cavern, and later working his way up to eventually engineer Lennon's Imagine album, that was a real treat. Yeah, I have a lot of time for Jack Douglas. It was cool to see all the Murray the K footage, the original fifth Beatle, or so he claimed to be at the time, but I think it verged on being a tad excessive after a while. That could maybe have been one of the bits they trimmed down. This clip of Ringo and Paul mucking around is really sweet.
No, not me. No. Me.
As nice as it is to see John and George interact, seeing the two surviving Beatles palling around in their early 20s is so lovely after all these years. Very fun to see George tee up James Ray's Got My Mind Set on You on the radio.
This is the James Ray singing, Got My Mind Set on You.
Little did George know that 23 years later, he would record his own version and it would go to #1 in America. I love the Beatles listening to I Wanna Hold Your Hand with those little earpieces before performing it on the Ed Sullivan Show. It's got real lip sync for your life energy. Look, I normally hate when people drum on the table with knives, but I'd let Ringo do it any time of day. In terms of the performances, I mean, there weren't really that many. They played at the Washington Coliseum and Carnegie Hall and then a couple of times on Ed Sullivan, but this wasn't a tour. They were just like visiting America, really. But I'm really glad that Beatles 64 features the best song from the Washington Coliseum concert, Long Tall Sally, where Ringo plays like a total madman towards the end. I love watching Paul McCartney play, but I really wish they didn't pan away from Ringo. Something else I enjoyed from Ringo is hearing him explain how he never wanted to be like back high up on a rostra. Instead, he wanted to be like down lower on the stage, to be closer to the rest of the band, to be like in the band.
I just always wanted to be in the band, not like, oh, I'm over here.
And to support his desires, you can actually see John and George like flanking Ringo and not standing way out in front of him, which was really nice. And of course, who doesn't love a foul-mouthed Paul McCartney?
We didn't give a flying fuck.
I also really appreciate the influence of Bob Dylan and his Free Willin' album that the Beatles were apparently listening to non-stop on that leg of the journey.
One time ago, a crazy dream came to me. I dreamt I was walking in World War III. You're in the morning, John and I get to bed at 8 o'clock. Coming home and back again. There he comes.
So now to conclude, what are my overall thoughts on Beatles 64? Well, look, I really did enjoy this. It's by no means the definitive Beatles documentary, but paints a pretty damn good picture of the first round of global Beatlemania. The 17 minutes of never-before-seen footage was fantastic for people like me who feel as though they've seen, like, every available second of Beatle video content that's out there. But I will say it's definitely 17 minutes spread out across the film, which I think is what you'd want anyway. Many of these clips we've seen before in previous docos, but often they'll be trimmed down to fit into an anecdote or a montage, whereas in Beatles 64 it really feels like they've just allowed Albert and David's footage to play out for as long as possible. Give the people what they want, you know? But it also may make the documentary feel a tad long in the tooth. I mean, not for me. I was eating up every second. band. But I can imagine if you're more of a casual fan, some of these archival clips might seem like they could use an edit, or even some of the talking head interviews. Most of these interviews I have found pretty damn inspiring, but I also sympathize with anyone who thinks some of these are just regurgitating what someone else in the documentary has already said about the band. But look, overall, this was a real treat, and if anything, seeing the magical restorative work applied to this old footage is reason enough for Beatles 64 to exist, in my opinion. Yeah, I would recommend this to die-hard fans or people who are just getting into the band, because there is really something for everyone here. Now cue all the old traditionalists who are going to be pissed off that it doesn't come as a physical release. Fellas, because it will be fellas, you've got to give that up. It's just not going to happen. But I would still love to hear from you, any of you. What did you think of the Beatles 64? Was it everything you hoped it would be, or were you left wanting a bit more? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, I know my release schedule has been fairly light on YouTube in the second half of this year, but that is because I've been working on multiple big videos. I'm really excited about what's to come on this channel, and I hope you are too. If you want to watch some bonus videos from me, I do upload a video every month over on my Patreon page. Recently, I've made ones about the Beatles in animation, the Britpop battle of Oasis and Blur, and even one on my recent trip to the United States. So if that sounds good to you, the link to join my Patreon is in the description. But otherwise, have a good one, everyone, and I will see you real soon. Bye-bye.
You know, I heard there's a glitch where you can meet Bob Dylan. It's weird. You only get one life in the game. Unless you play as Paul. Then you get two. Oh, sweet! I managed to get into the Plaza Hotel. Man, it's a lot of orgies.